I think that the likelihood of there being other, what we consider biological life, is extremely high, given you have all the elements for it. And we have more water on our outer moons than we have on Earth. So there could be something even on Europa.
Hello from the children of planet Earth.
Dianne, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. Thank you for coming on to our show. If you could maybe just start off with just your name and what do you do?
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm Dianne Dotson. You can call me Dianne. And I am a science fiction and fantasy author, science writer, content manager, and artist. And I have written 4 novels in the Questerzon saga, which is a mix of science fiction and fantasy. I write a lot of science articles of various subjects, mostly centered around biology, but occasionally veering toward geology and astronomy.
Fascinating. Super. Can you tell us about your Astronomy Club?
Okay. So when I was a young kid, I grew up in East Tennessee, and I was pretty bored. I lived out in the country, and I had friends that didn't live super close by for the most part. And I was becoming fascinated with astronomy because of my dad, and he had these big old astronomy books, and I would just pour through them and just became really fascinated with the science, but also just the beauty of the stars. And sometimes I would get up in really early hours and go out and look at the stars, sometimes with my little dog. But I wanted to educate my friends about astronomy because nobody seemed to know anything about it. It wasn't really taught in grade school very much, besides the sun, the planets, that kind of thing. And so I made a newsletter and a club, and we would meet and we would go over the newsletter, and it was completely hysterical. It's just, I had illustrations on it, and I would talk about stars and their magnitudes. And one of the issues I just recently dug up was about what life might look like on any planets circling the Centauri system, which now we know there are some. So it's really cool to look back on that and say, hey, I was imagining that and now it's real. And, kids today, they don't know what life was like before we knew for sure about exoplanets. So
that's fantastic. It's also incredible. I think also speaks to like sci-fi imagination becoming sort of sci-fi reality or science reality. You imagine things around other planets, and then they find out that there are more planets than stars, and these things are actually true. Do you remember what life looked like around the Centauri system?
Oh, it was, I did draw this really wacky illustration. It was very brief, and I was really more speculating, like what would it look like, and, what would it sound like? So I had just like a really strange illustration that didn't look remotely human, and I was, at that point, I had already seen the Star Wars movies, and, I had seen The Thing at that point. So that was starting to influence my worldview a little bit, and The Blob as well. And I had written a comic called Son of Blob to help me cope with because The Blob bothered me just like The Thing bothered me, because there was something plausible about it, something that was completely not E.T., like sort of sweet little alien shows up. It was like, there's something just really disturbing about both those movies that stuck with me. So I always had that in the back of my mind, but I also didn't want to be like, there could be killers out there, my friends, I was more just, what would they look like? What would they sound like?
Nice. As a child, so any favorite sort of astronomy stuff that sort of really drew you?
I was obsessed with the closest stars in our stellar neighborhood, like Sirius and the Centauri system, Bernard's star, things like that. But I was also fascinated by supergiants, so I don't know why I became really fascinated with supergiants that would eventually go nova or supernova, and I read up about that a lot and enjoyed that. I've always been interested in black holes, and not just because of Disney's The Black Hole, but that didn't hurt because that did have some influence on, my fascination. I used to think how horrific that must be to be, in a black hole. You wouldn't know because you'd be gone, right? So it wasn't like the Disney movie where he would likely come out the other side. Spoilers.
For sure. In the Heliopause, that's set on the edge of the heliosphere, which something I did not know about until a couple of months ago, and it is a fascinating part of our solar system. Could you explain a little bit about it to people who don't know?
The heliopause is basically the outer edge of our solar system, and helio meaning sun and pause meaning, ending point. So it's basically the point at which the sun's influence drops to zero, and then beyond that point is interstellar space. Like, it's a nebulous zone. There's not like this hard boom, you're here, you're there. And the Voyager spacecraft have crossed that border, and so they're now considered, both of them, to be in interstellar space, which is the space between stars. So the space between our star and the next closest star. We've, in the future, in the book, this is obviously in the future. It's actually in the 23rd century, and we have got various stations, research stations throughout the solar system, some of them quite remote, and that one being very remote, so communications, there would be a lag. It is sublight. I don't do FTL in that particular, the main story, try not to spoil things here, but, what they have to deal with, they can't do much about, they can't get somebody there fast when help is sent that meets, a bad fate, and it took long enough to get the help. And then when it gets there, oops, well, so much for that. They're on their own. So that was part of why I put it there, was so that they would have that incredible isolation of a research station. It's not a huge station. It's not like miles long. So, it's an intimate space. It can house about 500 people, Mandira.
Humanity. Do you think humanity is the future beyond Earth?
We already are making that happen. I think it's an inevitable thing. I don't know how far we will go, but I foresee we will settle on Mars. Maybe we'll settle on some outer moons eventually. And we might put out stations in the far reaches of the solar system, depending on what the goals are. And the reason I did that was because, much in the way that the International Space Station now is preparing us for interplanetary travel and living on another world, those research stations in my story were preparing us for interstellar travel eventually, and being isolated enough to have a sustainable environment that you could survive. And I don't know what that's going to look like for us. Are we going to have generation ships? Are we going to have, sort of printed personalities, or what? Or we're going to cryo freeze? How we're going to manage those different challenges? But I do see us having a future. And that was one of the questions that an early reader asked us, are we still around? Because I think that we were all feeling so nervous when this book came out. It was 2018. And, things were already kind of spiraling around the world a lot. And I said, yes, I believe, we are the kind of people, we've made it this far, and I think we will continue to go. And it is our nature to explore. And, we've sent out probes now beyond our system and all through the solar system, and we're continuing to send more. We're going to send people to Mars before long. It's an exciting time. And I don't know what all it's going to look like, but I know that, we are destined to be at least throughout our solar system.
Yeah, I think so. I think in some ways it needs to happen, and I think taking pressure off our local resources would be helpful. And also, one of the reasons why I love speaking to science fiction writers, because you guys literally just do think about this sort of stuff. What do you think humanity looks like in maybe 100 years?
Well, assuming we make it through the next, couple of years, with everything going on, I think that we become, out of necessity, far more, sustainably conscious, in what we reuse and recycle. We have to, because we're running out of, good potable water, or there's lots of drought, there's extreme weather, there's a lot of challenges we're dealing with around us and our ecosystem. And some ecosystems might collapse during that time. And that's going to have a ripple effect that we don't really know about yet. Like, we've speculated a lot about that, but my background is in ecology. So I think about that a lot. And I think about the interconnectedness that we all have. It's not just going to be about us. There's going to be other collapses that aren't directly involved with us, but that relate to us. Like, there's been a lot of concerns, for example, about bees and pollination. And we lose bees, we're going to be in trouble for produce, fruit and things like that. So anything that's threatening sort of our food chain is going to be a big concern. Obviously, as population grows, we have to address housing and how to feed everyone and things like that. We have a lot of resources on Earth still, and a lot of untapped potential, especially in our oceans, which we've barely explored. I think it feels like we've explored space more than we've explored our oceans. in terms of underneath the ocean anyway. So I think that humanity is going to face very quickly a lot of rapid fire challenges, and we have to be able to adapt. We've been adaptable so far. We've made it through a lot of catastrophe over the millennia, and I think that we can make it, but I think that we're going to have to learn to work together, and we're also going to have to rely more on technology to help us get there, and I don't know exactly what that's going to look like, but I like to think about machine learning and Internet of Things and AI and how that could help us. Like, it's already helping us now in terms of a pandemic and finding potential cures, not just for, viruses, but, chronic illnesses. We're using technology more and more. And I think that's definitely, we have to kind of marry that for our future survival. And, once we do make it to perhaps Mars and set up a colony there, that's going to create other challenges that's already being addressed and experimented on. So we have a future. It's just going to be, it's not going to be easy. Buckle up, basically.
You've studied zoology, and do you think that plays into some of your writing as well? Do you find you draw on some of that stuff?
Yes, absolutely. And that becomes more apparent in the later books. In Heliopause, there's a conservatory, so it's more botany related. There's not any animals on that ship other than microbes and things like that. So, and even some of that is even kind of regulated, which I don't really get into, but, I have a whole world building set up for this that I'm going to eventually have like a guide to all the ships and stations of the series. So I can talk about those things. But it's in the rest of the series, in the Quest Rasant saga, in Ephemeris, in Accretion, and especially in Luminiferous, I definitely draw on animal behavior and ecology and interaction of that, and how different animals and other creatures have adapted to certain environments. And some of them are quite exotic and look nothing like humans. Some of them are, essentially chimera of a couple of species. And then you have a telepathic fox-like animal that everybody fell in love with in Luminiferous. And, how does that work? How do they work in a pack? I talk a little bit about that and how they operate on their little hunts and things like that, and other creatures. So and I even in Ephemeris, there's a star city, a huge floating city in space that's been floating for millennia. And there's no living animals on there or pollinators, but there's little drones called syphilids that are pollinator drones. So I think that's probably going to be a thing that's going to happen probably sooner rather than later, technology-wise. So, but I blend all that animal science with the tech and ecology and world building, and it's a lot of fun to draw on it.
You mentioned sort of some of the animals not being sort of completely animals, and I'd sort of read that it's human-ish, or could you explain sort of how you sort of mesh together a bit of the biological and non-biological?
Well, that's an interesting question, because especially in Heliopause, there is a question of whether it's a computer problem going on, and it turns out absolutely not. It's an extraterrestrial problem, and that species is able to invade people's minds, and spread off in all these stalks throughout the galaxy. It's incredibly powerful, but still not powerful enough to reach everyone, and that's why it's after telepaths. They help make it stronger, and that being is a chimera of two species. I'm not going to spoil that, because that's a much later reveal, but it enables it to tap into two different species' strengths and makes it especially pernicious, kind of like a cancer. So I draw on that too, because I've worked in cancer research. So I thought, something that could spread and metastasize and take over something, which is a little like what the Thing is like, but it's different in this situation. It's not completely taking over. It's not trying to duplicate you. It's just literally taking over you, and it's feeding off your suffering while it keeps you alive, because that's what keeps it going. So it wants you to live, but it wants you to suffer, which is not something anyone would want to do, right? So it's a nasty, nasty villain, and it's a manipulator and a gaslighter too. So it feeds into relationships. But in terms of, there's also non-humans that are humanoid. I do have some of those, and a particular space mage, which calls himself a mage, but technology seems like magic, that kind of thing. And then I have creatures called the neuronids, which exist in a water environment, and they look kind of like giant neurons, and they work they work telepathically as well. So there's those. I have, undersea creatures, and I have tiny little multi-winged beings that live down in a giant pit. And, it just there's all kinds of stuff that I've made up and interacts with its environment in unique ways.
Do you think we're alone in the universe?
I think that the likelihood of there being other, what we consider biological life, is extremely high, given you have all the elements for it. And we have more water on our outer moons than we have on Earth. So there could be something even on Europa underneath the ice, because we have discovered extremophiles, which are microorganisms that live in extreme environments. And that's how we have PCR, so we can get tested for, pandemic stuff. So you use Thermophilus aquaticus, and that's lives at thermal vents, extremely high temperatures. And there's so much more that we haven't even discovered, that I think that it's highly plausible. At the very least, we've got that. And beyond the solar system, it's hard to say. Now, I recently made a Medium article about our bias regarding thinking about extraterrestrial life. And I wanted to address the fact that what we think of as life is what we know. We don't know what we don't know. And so there might be another form of life that we wouldn't recognize as being life, that wouldn't have a recognizable facet, of our biology on Earth, for example. And so same genetic markers and things like that. It might not have anything remotely like that. It might not even be carbon-based, So I think that we have to keep our minds open about what's out there. But I think it would be highly unlikely, just mathematically, for us to be the only planet with life in the universe, which is incredibly mind-bogglingly huge. And our galaxy alone is monstrously huge, So we already have, we have officially discovered over 5,000 planets in our galaxy. And that's just a tiny, tiny sliver of what's there. So, I'm not going to say, oh, yeah, there's definitely extraterrestrial life, because we haven't proven it yet. But the likelihood of it is high. And I don't think, it's fun to speculate, and it's fun to think about, aliens who can interact with us and things like that. And I've done that myself. And, my science fiction is sort of sci-fi mixed with fantasy even. So leaning a bit on space operas like Star Wars and Star Trek, things like that. So we don't know what's out there, but it's probably going to be pretty weird, I would imagine.
I suppose intelligent life then. What do you think intelligent life could look like in the rest of the universe?
It's hard to say. And there's a lot of debate over whether or not, if you reach a certain point, that you send probes out, which we've already done. But a more advanced civilization could look like something in which they don't interact at all with say, us, and they send something robotic, and who knows if they're even still alive, that kind of thing. I know that's been speculated a lot, and that seems kind of a logical thing to do. Like, why would you send, unless you had to, for some reason, why would you send anything to another surface unless you wanted to colonize it or populate it or take a resource? And even then, that could be completely drone related. Like, if you wanted to go mine something from Earth, you wouldn't need to bring your people there. You could just send something. If you had the technology to get that far, why would you need living beings to manage it? It doesn't make any sense. So I think that the evidence for that, if we don't pick up an actual signal, like a SETI radio signal, there's going to be another signature that we pick up that we maybe haven't been looking for, or we're just starting to look for. And I think that's going to be our bigger ticket there. I just don't know. I mean, there's definitely a possibility that there's intelligent life out there, and it's non-zero, because the more planets we find, the more likelihood of life, and the more likelihood of life, the more likelihood of advanced life, and the more likelihood of, advanced civilizations. There's probably not that many, but then again, we don't know. And I keep coming kind of back to that. Like, if there was a whole network of beings out there that interacted in this galaxy, and we're basically a backwater, we may not know in our lifetimes for sure whether or not there's anything out there, or in that 1,000 lifetimes. They may just not care, especially if, a rocky planet with good resources is very common. But then again, you have asteroids with resources that can be mined too. they may just not need or want us at all. And why would they come here?
Sure. We definitely don't even have the most water in our solar system.
No, we don't. And, for all we know, they put a sign around the solar system that says, quarantine, keep out.
First contact. How do you think communication could happen?
If it hasn't happened already and they've tried it coming this way, then I think that, the signals that we've come up with, I think that's probably the best we can do is to send packets of data, and information about us and try to send something that could resonate on a basic level. I know in contact, using the prime numbers was a method of communication, just to kind of have that basic universal language of math, which seems logical to me, but I kind of, again, feel like there's something missing that we're not thinking about, and we might be just looking the wrong direction. But I think if it happens, we're alive to see it. That would be really cool, but I'm not expecting it. And I think that we do need to be prepared for the possibility of it. What does it mean? I know there's government documents addressing, if this, then what, and how do we address the religious aspect and the questions that it brings up of our place in the universe. So I think we have to be careful. I think that we have not had the best history, and this is being very diplomatic, of interacting with other populations. We have basically used a sledgehammer instead of a pen, so to speak, in terms of interaction. So, and that's, again, much worse than sledgehammers.
From a zoology perspective, in terms of modes of communication, because we're trying to work out what a good base language would be. And one of the things that keeps on coming up is that we can't even speak to animals. And I'm wondering if there's any ideas out there on, modes of communication that aren't human that could be universal, essentially.
Right. Other than potentially math. And, I think something, and just breaking it all the way down to, basic biochemistry. I think biosignatures, that could be a way of doing it, and, we even in mammalia, we can't communicate. We can do some limited things with, primates, other primates, teach them to do sign language and things like that. We can teach parrots, like Alex, the African gray parrot, genius parrot, the Einstein of parrots, was trained to come up with, he came up with his own words based on objects that he knew and based on learning human language. He called an almond a cork nut. He came up with that himself. And if you look at it, it looks like a cork nut. So, we have some pretty smart animals. But in terms of trying to communicate with something that's beyond our planet, you always have to break it down. What's the most common basic thing at the core of it? And it might not even be DNA. Maybe amino acids. I don't think we can expect DNA off of Earth. Something else, but we can't really expect it, if that's an Earth-based molecule. So amino acids, that's a fair shot. I think that's a likely way to communicate, is we communicate biochemically. And honestly, that's how a lot of animals communicate too, insects particularly. So, we're going to have to use AI to figure it out. And honestly, we're going to have to do that here on Earth too. And I think that's being done. I know that AI has been used to try to decipher what manatees say to each other. I read a story about that recently. So we're on the cusp of being able to do a lot of things, but we need help with technology to do it. So just breaking it down to the basics, math, molecules, basic structures. So, and eventually maybe at the quantum level, we communicate that way. I don't know yet, but I know it's being looked at, because that's obviously a thing in tech that has been worked on for years. It's been part of science fiction for decades. So I think just keeping it as basic as we can and not thinking in terms of being human or even mammal, basic life form qualities. And even that's going to be exotic from somewhere else.
If we put a new record together, is there anything that you think would be good to put on a record in terms of a story of humanity and how we sort of address that?
Oh, I feel like we should start with the knowledge of how we evolved, so that this other species would know that we have traced our origins and understood at the genetic level what that means. And another, here's the molecular aspect again. We understand that we've reached a point from going from microbes of millions and millions of years ago to evolving and evolving and evolving, and that we have been through various stages of catastrophe, which is probably pretty common in the universe, and, meteor strikes and asteroids, things like that, mass extinction events. And I think so we would want them to know that, yes, we know we came from, a rather simple existence and we've made it this far. And that evidence would be hopefully logically instantaneous, but I would want them to see how we did it. I would want that history somehow conveyed. And I would want to provide the negatives as well as the positives of our life here and what we've done as a species and what we've learned. And I don't know how that could be conveyed, but I think it should be addressed, because we don't want to go out in the universe and say, hey, we're perfect little angels here. We've got this figured out. Hi, come see us. I think we need to address that we have had a very turbulent history and that we're trying to overcome it. And that's why we're doing this. And so I don't know what that looks like, but I think some basic coding to represent our history, our human history. And obviously they'll know a lot by looking at it, where we were when we launched it. So those two things. And then I admire adding music. I think there is value to that. I don't think it hurts, although it might be quite discordant or not even detectable to some creatures. But again, it would be AI that would be picking it up and figuring out what it is, most likely. So those would be some things I would include.
How do you think that finding life out there would change life here on Earth?
Well, if it were any time soon, social media would go crazy, and there'd be a lot of funny memes and videos and stuff like that. In terms of existential feelings, I think some people would be thrilled, and other people would be in denial. Quite a few people would be in denial, and other people would be appalled. And maybe there's some overlap among all those things. So, but I think there would be a lot of denial. I think it would, unless it's right in front of your face, it could be, oh, that's fake, that's fake. Somebody faked that, blah, blah, blah. So those are probably going to be the initial reactions. And anything beyond that, it's sort of like theology realm. I mean, I think a lot could be done to bend around that. Theology could evolve to adapt to that worldview in which we weren't the only people, So I don't think it would be the end of belief, and I think that there's a way around that. And I'm not a really religious person. I'm sort of pantheistic. I allow everyone, if you're not hurting anybody, that's what matters at the end of the day. So, but I definitely think there would be some upheaval, but there would be a lot of excitement. I think there'd be a lot of impatience. And then there'd be boredom. And then people would be kind of like, well, okay, this is just background noise now. There's stuff out there. It's advanced. I still have to go to work and come home, and I'm still broke, and I still have to eat and all this stuff. So what do I care? I think there's going to be a lot of that.
Is there anything that you have been finding fascinating over the last couple of months?
Wow, over the last couple of months. That's a good question. Other than the manatee thing, which I love, because, the animal side of it, and trying to figure out what they're saying to each other, which, we've not used AI as much for that because it's a more recent tech. We've tried to kind of figure it out logically other ways with recordings over a long time. That was a fascinating thing. I've been keeping an eye on the exoplanet news and the sheer number and scale of that. That's been something I always follow that. Like every week I go through and I search for news on exoplanets, and sometimes I'll share it on Twitter or wherever. So I'm always looking for that. And the more exotic the world they find, the more fun it is for me, like, oh, that one's basically a fluff ball. I love it. So the weirder it is, the more I get excited about it. So those are great things that are happening. And I think in terms of epidemiology, we're getting a lot of fascinating insight from all the data we're getting from COVID research, and I'm following that daily as part of my work. So my other work as a science writer and content manager, and I'm just completely fascinated by what we're uncovering, not just for viruses, but what we're finally digging into on the tiniest level. And I know someone at Caltech who had recently, finally figured out the actual molecular structure of the nuclear pore, which is a tiny, tiny thing in the nucleus, a pore in the nucleus of our cells, and they've got that all modeled now. And that just fascinated me so much. That's something I saw in the last couple of weeks. And I just was like, this is great. Like, what more are we going to learn about, that tiny part of our inner bodies? So.
Any advice for aspiring either authors or scientists or science communicators?
I would say keep an open mind and keep on top of current news. And if you want to know more about science, this is the best time that we've ever had to start. And because we have communication, we have the capability of talking to researchers who are doing this groundbreaking stuff in real time, which we didn't have access to, back when I started out in science. You had to kind of do it the old-fashioned way to get in touch with, can I have a print of your paper? Instead of just downloading it. So I think search for good source material. Keep an eye when you're doing your research on your source material. And this is something as a science writer that I think would be valuable for anybody in the university is, go for the .edu, the .gov, the .org, information. Use Google Scholar. It's very helpful in finding papers that, for anything that you need. And probably a lot of people already know that, but it is a powerful tool. And just, follow scientists, like subscribe to Planetary Society, subscribe to Nature, subscribe to genetic, research companies that, and aggregators of papers that comb that data every day. And never be afraid to ask scientists questions, because scientists love to be asked questions. They like to know that someone cares about their work, that they have spent there every single day for decades and a lot of sweat and blood and tears, working on. So ask those questions. Don't be afraid to. And just generally just keep asking questions. That's my overall advice, just generally in life.
Thank you so much. This has been wonderful. I mean, you're a fantastic guest. I feel very lucky because I love interviews where I learn a lot as well. So
I do too. And that's one great thing with the sci-fi author chat that I found is I'm learning so much from each. So some of the authors are engineers, some are geologists, some were English majors. And I'm like, they've all figured out how to convey wonders. And I love that. Sure. I love that diverse background. And I'm going to keep at it. I'm going to start adding in fantasy and horror and comics chats too, because all these writers have something of value to talk about.